Hi, I'm Lucien-Bay, and I'm the writer and animator of a short film called Atlas 1. In this tutorial, I'm mostly going to be going over how I did the facial animation in that. So if you haven't seen that yet, stop for a second, check for a link in the description, and then come back. Assuming you have seen it, let's get to it. I'll start first by going over the new digital human shader in iClone 7.7, and why this was a good time to make a tutorial about facial animation. So by now I think there's a pretty good chance that you've already seen the results of the digital human shader, and what this pretty much does is make the characters look significantly better than they did before. One of the biggest changes here is in the subsurface scattering maps that we can now use. This pretty much imitates the way light interacts with skin in real life, so that the skin in iClone appears a lot more realistic. Another addition is with micro-normal maps, which kind of give you the really fine detail in skin that you usually don't get in the regular normal maps that come along with your characters, which is really good for close-ups. And while there are a few other additions to the digital human shader, the last, probably most important bit is the changes to how eyes are handled. The eyes look a lot more realistic now than they used to, so being able to animate these in a realistic way is a lot more important now. Onto the importance of getting good animation now that we have more realistic looking skin. When you have better looking faces, or I should say more realistic looking faces, it becomes a lot more obvious if your animation is not quite so realistic, particularly if you don't have eyes moving, your faces aren't moving in a way that, you know, real people's faces move when they talk. It becomes a lot more jarring. So the biggest aim of this tutorial is so that you'll be able to do animation that is a little bit more fitting of the more realistic faces that we now have access to. The tutorial is for how to do this by hand. The fastest way to do facial animation is indeed by motion capture, but I don't have an iPhone 10. There are lots of people that don't have iPhones, and even if you do, you still need to be able to hand touch the animation to either tone up or down some of the movements and to smooth out a lot of the performance. There's this misconception that if you motion capture things, you don't need to fix them up after that. You just get to brush your hands off and walk away. That's almost never the case. What you learn in this tutorial will hopefully be helpful even if you use the iPhone 10. So how I do this is normally I start off with lip sync, then I go over to animating facial expressions, and then I finish by animating the eyes. It's usually best, in my opinion, to do the lip sync first, because if you start with facial expressions, you might be choosing expressions that actually make it difficult for you to evaluate how well or how effective your mouth shapes are during lip syncing. So what I have here is a small snippet of the scene. I'll just go ahead and play the animation so that we can take a look.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
So what I'm going to do here is strip away almost all the animation that I have so that we can start pretty much from scratch. And I'll go through, like I said, the phases of lip sync, expressions, and eye animation.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
So the first thing you're going to want to do is turn on audio scrubbing, which you can do by either pressing Ctrl H or going to preferences and just making sure that's checked there. This will allow you to hear the audio as you scrub along the timeline back and forth, and it's pretty much essential for us to be able to place the phonemes at exactly the right time. Otherwise there's going to be a lot of guesswork being used. The second thing to bear in mind is that you don't want to put the phonemes down in a way that makes them read well off screen. We're going to be using a lot of sound alikes. For example, sometimes we'll have an L and we'll use a TH kind of sound instead. It pretty much just comes down to what looks the best. It's not always obvious. It will take practice, and as time goes along, you'll just get much faster at it. The next thing we're going to do is go down to the voice clips options and just make sure a couple of things are checked. If you double click on the options, you'll see a window pop up, and under smooth I set mine to 2. That's pretty much for almost everything, and depending on what kind of intensity you want in that line, you can set the clip strength between 1 and whatever it is you want, but I, in this case, for this clip, set mine to 1.3. So finally we're going to go ahead and start the lip sync. So let's see what we have at the beginning.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual.
So we're going to start with the word operative, which is, you could, if you're going phonetically, you would kind of go with this shape, but like I said, sometimes you don't go for what you think it might be, you go for what looks better, and an ah that's toned down to maybe 52, 50 seems like it works much better. Usually if you set your clip strength to a bit high, a lot of these will maybe need to be low, but it gives you an option to go higher if you need to.
Operative. 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 Operative.
So you see there just in a few seconds, just by putting down a few of these phonemes,
Operative.
it's not going to look perfect without facial animation, so try not to get too too disappointed if you don't think it's going that well. But usually I would say get something that looks decent, and then you can come back to it once you have facial animation on if you think it doesn't look right.
Operative.
Now I'm going to have to fast forward the video a little bit here, even though some of you may think you want to sit there and watch me lip sync this whole thing, but the reality of it is this is the most boring part of the tutorial, and the really important bits are the rest of the face and the eyes. So I'm gonna skip some of this. I'll try and keep in a few of the more interesting bits maybe, but we probably want to get to the meat and bones of this tutorial. So we've got a pretty good result there. It doesn't have the intensity that you would want in the face, but that's because we haven't done the expression yet. Doing the facial expressions are actually fairly easy so long as you have a basic idea of how people move their faces. In iClone, with the character selected, you go over to the animation tab, hit face key, expression, and you'll see the list of all the expressions that we have access to. There are 7 categories normally, and each of those has 12 presets in them. So with our expression tab open, we'll just play through it really quickly to see what kind of emotion we kind of need to go for, and we can really quickly start
highly unusual. Too fast.
laying down some of the presets.
Likely predatory.
So
Operative.
for operative, we'll make him get a bit angry. We want it to start around here, so we'll just maintain this neutral facial expression that we have. And as he finishes saying the word, we'll go for angry and try that out.
Operative. Operative.
There we go, that works much better.
Unusual. Operative. The movement's highly unusual. The movement's high.
And for the movement's highly unusual, we'll go to surprise. And then we'll just manually bring his eyebrows down a little bit.
The movement's highly unusual.
And we'll pull that keyframe in a bit so that he transitions to it a bit faster.
The movement's highly operative. The movement's highly. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast.
So for too fast, we will go to disgust, which is a little similar to angry, but gives a bit more variation if we use that rather than angry all the time.
Highly unusual. Too fast.
Yeah, it's not so bad. We'll just change the timing of that a little bit.
Too fast. Likely not really unusual. Too fast.
Okay, so I just want it to happen as he's turning his head, so we'll just pull it sooner.
Usual. Too fast.
Nice.
Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely non-human.
And for likely non-human, we'll actually go to angry.
Fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
And for predatory, we will do fear. Take that up to 100. And we don't really want his eyebrows going too high.
Likely predatory.
And have it a little bit sooner so it happens as he's saying the word predatory.
Human. Likely predatory.
And then we're going to hit default to have him just slowly go back to a neutral.
Likely predatory.
And we'll watch over.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
And there you go. That's a pretty decent first pass at doing the facial expressions. So onto the final part of the facial animation section. Possibly the most important part is the eyes.
Operative.
These are pretty simple and a lot of fun. Generally, you select the under eye area and the eye. Why do you select both, you may ask? It's so that when you move the eyes around, the underneath of his eye kind of bulges with it, which is much more realistic than, say, just moving the eyeball around. You can see that's not nearly as good. So just delete those keyframes, select those. For now, what we're going to do is move his eyes as his head moves around. So when his head moves a bit right, I'll make him look right first, because generally that's what people do. A little eye movement to the left will precede a head movement to the left, just by a little bit.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. The movement's highly The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely non. Likely non-human. Like human. Likely predatory. Likely predatory.
So yeah, I didn't talk very much there so that I could just blaze through it. But pretty much what I did was that before making a change, I would make sure that the muscle and eyeball tracks had the keys down so that we would know where to start the animation from, and then very quickly transition to where the eye animation was going to go. So let's just take a quick look.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
So that looks a lot more natural. And before I carry on, some of these eye movements are quite big. So from here he's looking from left to right. So yeah, from left over to the right. It's in real life we usually get a blink at a time like that. So if we just go in between the two keyframes, I'll just delete that now so you can see in between these two keyframes I've got the timeline. I'm going to take the eye blink over to 100, and by the time it gets to the next keyframe the eye will be open again, and it looks a lot more natural when an eye movement from all the way to the left to all the way to the right has a blink in the middle. Here we just got a lucky timing with the blink. And maybe we could benefit from a blink here too. Yep. So let's take a look.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
And I just threw in a really slow blink at the end there. So that was really quick, but you can imagine how if you have a lot of practice with that, you could populate just all of your scene in a fairly short amount of time. Use even the eye animation there really wasn't that difficult, so long as you kind of generally know where to put things, lay them down really basically the first time and then refine it afterwards, and you can get pretty good results in a fairly short amount of time.
Operative. The movement's highly unusual. Too fast. Likely non-human. Likely predatory.
The lighting and HUD effects were last because they're so simple. The scene was primarily lit with one spotlight that was placed a short distance from the character's head. The idea was to limit the lighting to just a very small part of his face, which was really simple to do with the lighting settings. The first step is to angle the beam so it encompasses his face, but doesn't light up too much of his chest or forehead. From there, the fall off was adjusted to make the outer area of the spotlight much darker than the center, leaving a noticeable gradient as the light spread from the center of his face. Lastly, the attenuation was increased, making the fall off much more pronounced. This is the same light that was animated to change color and intensity later in the film for the warning lights. The HUD was mostly made with video textures. These were good because they're easy to find online and have the added benefit of lighting up our main character's face, in addition to the main light, adding a more dynamic feel to the film. iClone accepts a wide variety of video formats. Right-clicking and dragging a video from its folder into the 3D window automatically creates a video plane, which I then resized and linked to the main character's head so they would follow its movement. Light was cast from the video plane via the texture's global illumination setting. In short, I kept the self-illumination scale low so it could be subtle, but there's the option to turn this up quite high depending on your needs. Atlas 1 was rendered in iClone, but if you wanted to do something like this in Unreal with the help of LiveLink, it would be fairly simple. I've already done an overview of Unreal LiveLink for iClone recently, so I won't be getting too specific about that here, but as you can see, the character, animation and lighting all transferred over, including the facial animation. It's particularly useful to be able to iterate on the face in iClone and immediately see the results in Unreal. Applying the HUD effects isn't quite as simple as the drag and drop procedure in iClone, however. There's more than one way to do it. I made a video texture and applied that to a plane, which I then attached to the main character's head. It's also worth noting that in both iClone and Unreal, although more so in Unreal, video textures do cause a performance drop and should mostly only be done once you're happy with the animation. In the Unreal content browser, create a folder called Movies. Once in the folder, click on Import and select the MP4 file that you want for your video texture. This will create a file media source, which will kind of represent your file in Unreal. Right-click in the content browser, go to the Media submenu and select Media Player. You'll get a pop-up asking if you want to add a video asset. Check that and hit OK. This will create a media player asset and a video texture asset. Double-clicking on the media player and then on the file will let you confirm that the video texture is imported and working properly. It's then possible to drag the video texture onto the mesh you want. In this case, I'll drag it onto a simple plane from the Modes menu. This will create a material which we'll need to modify in order to make it transparent. Double-click on the material and in its schematic, click on the media player object. In its properties, change its blend mode to alpha composite, and then connect the RGB node on the texture sample to the opacity node on the media player object. This won't always be the right thing to do, but in the case of the sample I'm using here, the background is black, so using the texture as its own alpha channel is a quick and easy way to make it transparent. You can also connect the RGB mode to the emissive color node to make the texture emit light in a similar way as it did in iClone. Back in the Unreal 3D window, it's time to attach the plane to our character's head. Select it and in the Details tab under Transform, make sure its mobility is set to Movable. Now you can right-click on the plane, scroll down to Attach To, and select your character. This will bring up a menu that lets you choose the bone for attachment. I'll pick the head. Now you can position the plane where you want, and it will move along with our character's head. The final step is to trigger the video so it actually plays. There are many ways to do this, but the simplest is probably from within Sequencer. Once you have your iClone animation recorded, right-click in Sequencer and select Media Track. Add a keyframe where you want the video to start playing and select the file media source that we created earlier. Right-click on the newly added clip and under Properties, Media, Media Texture, select the video texture that we also added earlier. Now playing the sequence back will play the video texture when it hits the appropriate part of the timeline. And that brings us finally to the end of this tutorial. There was a lot to cover and there will no doubt be some areas that could have been a little bit more detailed. If you have any questions, let us know in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm Lucien-Bay and hopefully I'll be seeing you again soon.